Throughout history, women have been on the front lines of progress. No matter where, no matter when, women were there. Abolition, suffrage, civil rights, and of course, the labor movement. Child labor laws, forming unions, safety reforms, equal opportunities, women have been the steady drumbeat, ensuring progress for all. Even when the history books would somehow forget to include her name? But this isn't history class. This is HERstory in Hardhats. We're celebrating Women's History Month and Women in Construction Week by celebrating the HERstory of those pioneering path pavers that made it possible for us to be here today doing the work we mostly love. Come on, nobody loves checking email. Some names may sound familiar, but I hope to introduce you to stories that you haven't heard before or perspectives that you haven't considered. Because history isn't just about memorization, it's about the lessons that we take away. I use history as a tool for better decision making, stronger teams, and clearing paths for the road ahead. We can't know where we're going if we don't know where we've been. It can be hard to imagine what life was like 200 years ago. But just like us, no two experiences were the same. Some of these women were former slaves. Others were born into privilege. But there's a through line, a common thread: resilience, fortitude, bravery, inspiration. If we look closely, we might just see glimpses of ourselves in them. In early America, we have women fighting for freedom from varying viewpoints. We have women fighting for the freedom to work, and we have women fighting for freedom, period. In order to properly lay the groundwork for women in construction that we look to for inspiration, I thought it best to lay out the generations of progress that got us from cradle to today. Looking at our first 100 years or so, the fight to be free from total subjugation would be the goal of most of the nation. But how do you achieve freedom without a seat at the table? Organizing, agitating, and educating, as Susan B. Anthony would say. I want to start by quickly highlighting the abolitionist movement, where enslaved Black Americans and abolitionists fought for freedom and to the end of slavery. This was granted under the 13th Amendment, which was sparked by the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Some key women to note here would be Harriet Tubman, of course, and Sojourner Truth. The next era that we would go into would be the Reconstruction era, which also includes Jim Crow and the women's suffrage movement. A reminder that progress often comes with loss, because those Jim Crow laws were meant to resubjugate a lot of the slaves that were freed. You see with the passing of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to Black men. But because of Jim Crow and racism, the segregation laws quickly followed. The women's suffrage movement was a long, hard-fought battle, and it was very divisive. Some women to note here would be Susan B. Anthony, Ida B. Wells Barnett, and Sojourner Truth. They all argued that women are also citizens, and under the 14th Amendment, which stated that all people born or naturalized in this country are seen as citizens, regardless of former servitude. Anthony and other suffragists used that wording as an excuse or a reason to vote illegally. Something that's often repeated is that women weren't allowed to work, or that women didn't work. Quite the opposite. Women have worked since the dawn of time. In fact, most women had no choice. And it certainly did look a little different based on the scale of life that you were born into. Slavery, indentured servitude, domestic labor, these were the three levels where most women kind of sat. And then as decades progressed, seamstresses and factory work housed more and more women. Also, cultural changes, politics, society, this greatly impacted where women would be placed in work life. After 1920, with the passing of the 19th Amendment, which gave white women the right to vote, there were so many changes that could come, because now women would have a voice, a seat at the table. So many labor rights started to come our way. But remember, Jim Crow is still in place. So hold that thought. Unfortunately, it isn't long after women win the right to vote and they're enfranchised in this country that World War II starts. I suppose the silver lining for this, maybe, is that it opens up new industries for women to begin working in. Construction, shipbuilding, welding, as men go off to war. But all women were not quickly convinced to join these workforces. Women hadn't been at the table long, it wasn't very safe, and they weren't going to get paid much. There was also heavy discrimination for Black and Latina workers. But the numbers did skyrocket. In fact, it was about 70% married women, 90% unmarried women in those respective fields during World War II. Post-World War II, however, it went from 70 and 90% to 30 and 40% respectively. Not all by choice, many were forced out. Not very fair if you ask them. Between the segregation, Jim Crow laws, voter suppression, and employee discrimination, in comes the civil rights movement. Women like Betty Friedan, Angela Davis, Dorothy Height, they start to usher in some of the most significant legislative changes that would help fight against the discrimination in the workplace and usher in women's rights at a level this country had never seen. And now this one you may recognize, including one group out of Texas, Fort Worth, Texas to be exact. 16 women got together in 1953 and formed an organization called NAWIC, the National Association of Women in Construction. NAWIC has played a critical role in pushing for stronger labor laws, access to apprenticeships, support and mentorship, like the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which aimed to address the gender pay gap, or the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This is Title VII. This bans discrimination based on gender and race in hiring. How about the Occupational Health and Safety Act of 1970, or OSHA? Those mandatory safety standards are a direct result of increased women and minorities in the workplace. Those inclusive voices, yeah, that's us, baby. Now, you've probably heard of Title IX as a part of like girls' sports. So like this is how we have girls' basketball teams, for example. But it's also how we have vocational training. This is how we have BOCES, P-Tech programs, career and construction days, things that we literally do. Title IX is vital to the work that we do, and it prohibits the discrimination against gender in federally funded education programs. The work hasn't stopped. It's continued right through to today. I hope hearing some of this today makes you realize how important you are just by being a woman in construction, how impactful you are just by taking up the space that you take up. As Maya Angelou said, each time a woman stands up for herself, without knowing it possibly, without saying it, she stands up for all women. Happy Women in Construction Week.